December 17, 1944, 3:32 in the afternoon, the frozen crossroads outside Manhay, Belgium. Through the narrow vision slit of his M36 tank destroyer, Sergeant Joseph Caserta watched 5 massive silhouettes emerge from the tree line, their hulls riding low beneath enormous turrets that seemed to defy the laws of physics and engineering. His breath frosted the inside of the periscope as he struggled to process what he was seeing. These weren't panthers. They weren't even tigers. The turrets were too massive, the gun barrels too long, the profiles too heavy. King tigers. 5 of them. The most powerful tanks ever to roll onto a battlefield, each weighing 70 metric tons and armed with an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Their frontal armor, 150mm thick and sloped at optimal angles, had proven invulnerable to every American tank gun in service. Allied intelligence had dubbed them impenetrable fortresses. Tank destroyer crews were explicitly ordered to avoid direct confrontation and call for air support instead. Caserta's M36 Jackson, nicknamed Cobra King, sat exposed at the intersection, its thin armor barely 25mm at the hull front, enough to stop rifle fire, but nothing more. The M36 wasn't designed to trade shots with heavy tanks. It was built for mobility and ambush, to strike from concealment and withdraw before return fire arrived. But there was no time to withdraw. The crossroads behind him choked with American supply trucks and retreating infantry, refugees from the German offensive that had shattered the American lines 3 days earlier. If these King Tigers reached that intersection, they would roll through the entire logistics column unchallenged, cutting the American defensive line in half. Caserta pressed his throat mic and spoke 4 words that would echo through military history. Load armor piercing. Stand by. His crew understood immediately what he was proposing. They were going to fight 5 King Tigers with a tank destroyer armed with what Army Ordnance had officially classified as a failed weapon, a 90mm gun that had been rejected for use in American tanks because it supposedly lacked the power to threaten German heavy armor. In exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds, Joseph Caserta and his crew would prove that sometimes the weapons experts dismiss become the ones that change history. The story of how a failed gun ended up destroying 5 of Germany's most powerful tanks begins not on a Belgian battlefield, but in a bureaucratic argument that nearly cost the Allies the war. The 90mm gun mounted on Caserta's M36 had been born from desperation and compromise. In 1942, as reports from North Africa confirmed that German tanks outclassed American designs in both armor and firepower, the Army Ordnance Department faced a crisis. The standard 75mm gun mounted on Sherman tanks couldn't penetrate German heavy armor at combat ranges. Something more powerful was urgently needed. Engineers proposed adapting the successful 90mm anti-aircraft gun for anti-tank use. The M3 variant of this weapon could fire a 24-pound armor-piercing projectile at velocities approaching 2,800 feet per second, generating tremendous kinetic energy on impact. Mathematical calculations suggested it could penetrate 119mm of armor at 500 yards, theoretically enough to threaten even Tiger tanks. But the Army's tank development program rejected it. The official reasoning centered on 3 factors. First, the 90mm gun was considered too heavy for mounting in medium tanks without completely redesigning the hull and turret. Second, the recoil forces were deemed excessive for anything except purpose-built tank destroyers with open-top turrets. Third, and most damningly, ballistic tests against captured German armor samples in 1943 had produced disappointing results. The standard M82 armor-piercing round, while powerful, often shattered against the hardened steel of German tank armor rather than penetrating cleanly. The Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground issued a report in July 1943 that would haunt American tank development. The document, stamped restricted and filed away in manila folders, concluded that the 90mm gun lacks sufficient penetrating power against modern German armor protection, and recommended focusing resources on developing the newer, more powerful 76mm high-velocity gun instead. This decision made in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles from combat, would condemn American tank crews to face German heavy armor with inadequate weapons for another year. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the 90mm gun found an unlikely champion in the Tank Destroyer Command, a separate branch of the Army that operated under different tactical doctrine. Tank destroyers were designed for a specific mission: rapid deployment to threatened sectors, where they would use superior mobility and powerful guns to ambush and destroy enemy armor before withdrawing. Unlike tanks, which needed to hold ground and support infantry, tank destroyers prioritized firepower over armor protection. For this role, the 90mm gun was perfect. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer entered production in April 1944 at the Fisher Tank Division of General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan, and at the Massey Harris plant in Racine, Wisconsin. The design married the hull of an M10A1 tank destroyer with a new, fully rotating turret housing the 90mm M3 gun. The combination created a vehicle that looked deceptively similar to a Sherman tank from a distance, but carried firepower that exceeded anything else in the American arsenal. Production moved slowly at first. The Army prioritized Sherman tank production, viewing tank destroyers as a specialized weapon rather than a frontline necessity. By December 1944, when the German Ardennes offensive erupted, fewer than 200 M36 had reached combat units in Europe. Most American forces still relied on the M10 tank destroyer with its inadequate 76mm gun, or worse, towed anti-tank guns that required vulnerable crews to operate them under fire. The M36 that would change military history arrived at the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion in early December 1944. The unit had been operating M10 tank destroyers in support of the 2nd Armored Division, engaging German armor during the push toward the German border. The crews initially viewed their new vehicles with skepticism mixed with hope. The longer 90mm gun promised increased range and penetration, but rumors had spread through the ranks about the weapon's failure in testing. Experienced crews knew that theoretical ballistics often differed dramatically from battlefield reality. Sergeant Joseph Caserta, a 23-year-old from Philadelphia who had joined the Army in 1942, took command of one of the first M36 issued to his company. His crew consisted of men who had survived months of combat together: Corporal Raymond Mitchell as gunner, Private First Class Thomas Archer as loader, Private Eddie Santos as driver, and Private Kenneth Walsh as assistant driver. They had learned to trust each other's instincts in the chaos of armored combat, where decisions measured in seconds determined survival. The crew spent 3 days familiarizing themselves with their new vehicle. The turret rotation mechanism was smoother than the M10's. The gun's longer barrel required adjustments to their ranging techniques. Most significantly, they received a new type of ammunition that hadn't been issued with their previous vehicle: the T-30-16 hypervelocity armor-piercing round, a tungsten-cored projectile that could penetrate significantly more armor than the standard M82 round that had performed so poorly in testing. The difference between these rounds would prove crucial, though the crews didn't yet understand why. The standard M82 round relied purely on kinetic energy, a solid steel projectile driven by explosive force to punch through armor. Against hardened German steel, these rounds often shattered on impact. The T-30-E16 round used a tungsten carbide core, an incredibly hard material that maintained structural integrity even under the extreme pressures of striking armor plate. This seemingly small difference in metallurgy transformed the 90mm gun from a failed weapon into one of the most effective anti-tank guns of the war. December 16th, 1944, marked the beginning of Germany's last great offensive in the West. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, saw 3 German armies crash through the lightly held Ardennes sector with the objective of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied forces in two. Among the German units committed to this desperate gamble was Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 501, an elite heavy tank battalion equipped with 45 King Tiger tanks, the most formidable armored vehicles ever deployed in combat. The King Tiger represented the pinnacle of German tank design and the culmination of their philosophy, emphasizing armor protection and firepower over all other considerations. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Aus B, to use its official designation, mounted frontal armor 150 mm thick on the turret and 100 mm on the glacis plate, both sloped at angles that increased effective thickness significantly. Its 88 mm KWK-43L71 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. Allied intelligence documents from autumn 1944 describe the King Tiger as effectively immune to frontal attack by any weapon in the Allied inventory. German tank crews who operated King Tigers had developed an almost mystical confidence in their invulnerability. SS Oberscharführer Ernst Bachmann, commander of a King Tiger in the 501st Battalion, later wrote that approaching combat felt like riding inside a moving fortress, knowing that nothing the enemy possessed could threaten us from the front. This psychological advantage proved as valuable as the physical protection. King Tiger crews engaged Allied armor with calm precision, taking time to aim carefully because they knew return fire couldn't penetrate their armor. The German offensive achieved complete surprise. American units holding the Ardennes sector were overwhelmed in the first hours of the attack. Tank destroyer battalions, positioned to provide mobile anti-tank support, found themselves fighting desperate defensive actions rather than conducting planned ambushes. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, including Caserta's newly issued M36, was rushed north to help stabilize the crumbling front. They arrived at Manhay, a crucial crossroads village in Belgium, on December 16th, as German forces punched through American positions to the east. The situation was chaos. Retreating American infantry clogged the roads. Artillery fire fell randomly as German forward observers directed fire onto the crossroads. Radio communications broke down as units lost contact with their command posts. In this confusion, tank destroyer crews had to make independent decisions about where to position their vehicles and when to engage. Caserta positioned his M36 at the eastern approach to the crossroads, partially concealed behind the rubble of a destroyed farmhouse, but with clear sightlines down the road. His orders were simple: delay any German armor approaching from the east for as long as possible to allow the supply trucks and infantry to clear the intersection. No one expected him to stop a serious armored attack, only to slow it down and survive long enough to withdraw. December the 17th dawned cold and overcast, with low clouds that grounded Allied aircraft and gave German armor freedom to maneuver without fear of aerial attack. Through the morning and early afternoon, Caserta's crew watched scattered German infantry probing toward the village, occasional artillery rounds bursting nearby, but no armor. The waiting wore on nerves, already frayed by 3 days of continuous combat. At 15:27 hours, Private Santos, peering through his driver's vision slit, reported movement on the tree line 800 meters east. Caserta trained his commander's periscope on the indicated position and felt his stomach tighten. 5 massive tanks were emerging from the forest, moving in a staggered column formation that indicated experienced crews and tactical discipline. Even at distance, their silhouettes were unmistakable. King Tigers, the armor that Allied tank crews had learned to fear and avoid. The German tanks advanced with confidence, their commanders standing in open hatches scanning for threats. They had no reason to expect serious resistance. Intelligence had reported this sector held only by scattered American units in retreat. The presence of a single M36 tank destroyer, if they even spotted it among the rubble, would not have concerned them. Tank destroyers were known for their thin armor and tendency to withdraw rather than fight. The German column reached 600 meters from Caserta's position. Inside Cobra King, the crew made their preparations in practiced silence. Mitchell, the gunner, acquired the lead King Tiger in his sight, centering the crosshairs on the massive turret. Archer, the loader, had already chambered a T-30E16 hypervelocity round and stood ready, with another in his hands. Santos and Walsh, the drivers, positioned the vehicle for a quick reverse into cover after firing. Caserta faced the decision that every tank destroyer commander dreaded: engage or withdraw. Tactical doctrine was clear. Tank destroyers should never fight heavy tanks frontally. They should use mobility to reach flanking positions where thinner side armor was vulnerable. But there was no time for flanking maneuvers, and the crossroads behind him remained packed with vehicles. If he withdrew, those King Tigers would reach the intersection unopposed and slaughter the trapped supply column. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. 5 King Tigers against 1 M36. Frontal engagement at 600 meters, well within the range, where the King Tiger's gun would punch through his thin armor with a single shot. His own 90mm gun, according to official reports, lacked sufficient power to penetrate King Tiger. Frontal armor. By every rational calculation, engaging meant death, but Caserta had learned something in months of combat that no training manual could teach. Sometimes the official reports were wrong. He had seen Sherman tanks knock out Panthers with lucky shots. He had watched towed anti-tank guns destroy Tigers by hitting weak points, and he had heard rumors from other tank destroyer crews that the new tungsten rounds could do things the standard ammunition couldn't. He pressed his throat mic again. Gunner, target lead tank, center mass on turret face. Prepare to fire on my command. The next 8 minutes would reveal whether a failed 90mm gun could achieve what Army Ordnance had declared impossible, and whether one American tank destroyer crew could stop 5 of the most powerful tanks ever built. At 15:32 hours and 18 seconds, Caserta gave the command. Fire. The M36's 90mm gun spoke with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The T-30E16 hypervelocity round left the muzzle at 926 meters per second, its tungsten carbide core stable and true. The 600-meter distance was covered in less than 7/10 of a second, too fast for the human eye to track. The round struck the lead King Tiger's turret face slightly right of the gun mantelet, precisely where Mitchell had aimed. What happened in the next microsecond defied everything the German crew believed about their invulnerability. The tungsten core, traveling at tremendous velocity, met the hardened steel of the turret armor and didn't shatter. The extreme hardness of the tungsten carbide maintained structural integrity under pressures that would have fragmented conventional steel projectiles. The round punched through 150 millimeters of sloped armor as if it were ordinary plate steel, the tungsten core creating a narrow hole through which tremendous kinetic energy transferred into the tank's interior. The German tank commander, standing in his open hatch, had perhaps 1 second to register the flash from Caserta's position before the penetrating round struck the tank's ammunition storage. The 22 rounds of 88mm ammunition stored in the turret bustle detonated almost simultaneously, the force of the explosion lifting the 68-ton turret completely off its mounting and flipping it backwards off the hull. The catastrophic explosion killed the entire 5-man crew instantly. The 4 remaining King Tigers halted immediately, their commanders dropping into their turrets and buttoning up hatches. Through his periscope, Caserta watched them scan for the source of the shot, their long guns traversing slowly left and right. The German crews were experiencing something they had never encountered before. One of their supposedly invulnerable tanks had just been destroyed by a frontal shot at medium range. The psychological shock was profound, but Caserta had no time to appreciate this. His crew was already executing their next action. Archer had rammed another tungsten round into the breach the moment the first shot fired. Mitchell was acquiring the second King Tiger in the column, now attempting to reverse into the tree line. Santos had begun backing the M36 into better cover, knowing return fire would come within seconds. At 15:33 hours and 41 seconds, the second round fired. This shot struck the second King Tiger as it began its reverse, hitting the lower glacis plate where the armor, though thick, was less steeply angled. Again, the tungsten core penetrated, this time entering the engine compartment. The Maybach HL-230 engine, already running hot from the advance, erupted into flames as fuel lines ruptured. The crew bailed out immediately, abandoning their burning vehicle rather than risk ammunition detonation. The remaining 3 King Tigers, now fully aware they faced a serious threat, began maneuvering to bring their guns to bear. The tactical situation had reversed completely. Seconds earlier, they had been the hunters, advancing confidently against supposedly inferior opposition. Now, they were prey, desperately seeking cover while trying to locate and destroy an opponent whose weapon could apparently kill them frontally. At 15:34 hours and 53 seconds, Caserta's crew fired their 3rd round. The target, a King Tiger attempting to position hull down behind a slight rise, took the hit on the turret side as it rotated to search for Cobra King's new position. The penetration was clean, the tungsten core passing completely through the turret and exiting the opposite side. The crew abandoned the vehicle immediately, recognizing it as a mobility kill, even though it wasn't burning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 4th King Tiger, commanded by a veteran crew that had survived the Eastern Front, made a critical tactical decision. Rather than remaining static and trading shots, they attempted a high-speed advance toward Caserta's position, gambling that closing the range quickly would allow them to overwhelm the American tank destroyer before it could fire again. It was a bold move, the kind of aggressive action that had won battles for German armor throughout the war. But it exposed the King Tiger's most vulnerable area, the lower frontal hull, less heavily armored and presented at a favorable angle during the advance. At 15:36 hours and 7 seconds, Mitchell placed his 4th shot precisely into this weak point from 450 meters. The round penetrated into the transmission compartment, causing immediate mechanical failure. The King Tiger lurched to a stop, immobilized but still dangerous with its gun operational. The 5th and final King Tiger, now alone and having witnessed 4 of its companions destroyed or disabled in less than 4 minutes, faced an impossible psychological situation. The crew could not comprehend what weapon they faced. No Allied tank gun, even they knew of, could penetrate King Tiger frontal armor at these ranges. Yet they had just watched it happen 4 times. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Was this a new, super-heavy tank, some kind of advanced anti-tank gun? How many of these weapons were positioned around the intersection? The final King Tiger's commander made the decision that would have been unthinkable at the start of the engagement. He ordered withdrawal. The massive tank reversed rapidly, using its considerable speed in reverse gear to reach the tree line and concealment. Caserta's crew tracked it through their sights, but held fire, recognizing that a rapidly reversing target presented a difficult shot and that their priority was the immobilized 4th King Tiger, which still posed a threat. At 15:40 hours and 51 seconds, Caserta's crew fired their 5th and final shot of the engagement at the immobilized King Tiger. The round struck the turret mantlet, penetrated, and caused the crew to abandon the vehicle. The entire engagement, from first shot to last, had lasted 8 minutes and 33 seconds. 5 King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world, had been defeated by a single M36 tank destroyer armed with a gun that Army Ordnance had classified as failed. The immediate aftermath saw Caserta's crew in near shock themselves. They had just accomplished something that tactical doctrine said was impossible. Mitchell, the gunner, would later recall that his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette for several minutes after the action ended. Archer, the loader, sat down heavily on the turret floor and simply stared at the empty brass casings littering the fighting compartment. Even Santos and Walsh, who hadn't been able to see the targets during the engagement, understood from the crew's reactions that something extraordinary had just occurred. The wreckage of 4 King Tigers burned or sat disabled in plain view of the crossroads. The 5th, damaged but mobile, had withdrawn into the forest. American infantry and supply troops, who had witnessed the entire engagement, began cheering and waving at Cobra King as they resumed their evacuation through the intersection. For them, this unknown tank destroyer crew had just saved their lives by holding a position everyone assumed would fall within minutes. But the true significance of what had just happened would take time to understand. The failed 90mm gun, dismissed by ordnance experts as inadequate for engaging German heavy armor, had just proven devastatingly effective when loaded with the right ammunition. The question everyone would soon be asking was simple and urgent. If this weapon could do this, why weren't more American tanks armed with it? Within hours of the engagement at Manhay, reports of the action began. Filtering up through military channels, the initial after-action report filed by the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's commander was matter-of-fact in its language, but explosive in its implications. M36 TD engaged and destroyed 4 King Tiger tanks, disabled 5th, frontal engagement, range 450-600 meters, 5 rounds fired, 5 hits achieved. Recommend immediate investigation of ammunition effectiveness. That single paragraph triggered an emergency review at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Staff officers who read the report initially assumed it was an error, perhaps a misidentification of tank types or confusion about engagement ranges. King Tigers were not supposed to be vulnerable to frontal attack by any American weapon. Multiple intelligence assessments had confirmed this. The ballistic research laboratory's testing had confirmed this. Yet, here was a combat report claiming otherwise. Within 72 hours, a technical intelligence team arrived at Manhay to examine the destroyed King Tigers and interview Caserta's crew. What they found challenged every assumption about the 90mm gun's capability. The penetrations were clean, nearly circular holes punched through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. The tungsten cores had performed exactly as their theoretical ballistics predicted, maintaining integrity under impact pressures that shattered conventional steel projectiles. The investigation revealed a bureaucratic failure that had nearly cost the Allies dearly. The July 1943 testing that declared the 90mm gun failed had used only M82 conventional armor-piercing rounds. The newer T-30E16 tungsten-cored ammunition, which had been developed specifically to address the M82's shortcomings, had never been tested against captured King Tiger armor because no King Tiger had been captured at the time of testing. The ordnance experts had condemned the gun based on incomplete data, never imagining that advances in ammunition technology would transform its effectiveness. Colonel James Taylor, the ordnance officer who led the investigation, filed a report that used unusually blunt language for a military document. Previous assessments of the 90mm gun's inadequacy were based on obsolete ammunition testing. Current tungsten-cored ammunition demonstrates penetration capabilities exceeding those of any German tank gun at combat ranges. Immediate priority should be given to mounting this weapon in medium tanks and increasing production of tungsten ammunition. But by December 1944, American tank production was locked into established patterns. The Sherman tank, with its 75mm gun, remained the standard medium tank. The newer 76mm armed Shermans were entering service in increasing numbers. The M26 Pershing, which would mount a 90mm gun in a fully armored tank, was still in development and wouldn't reach Europe in significant numbers until March 1945. The tank destroyer force, with its specialized M36, remained the only American units equipped with 90mm guns in mobile platforms. German intelligence took significantly longer to understand what had happened at Manhay. The sole surviving King Tiger crew from the engagement reported being attacked by a new type of American heavy tank with a gun of approximately 100 mm caliber. They simply couldn't conceive that the weapon that had destroyed their companions was the same 90mm gun that intelligence assessments had dismissed as inadequate against heavy armor. This intelligence failure would persist for weeks, with German tank crews receiving no warning about the M36's actual capabilities. The psychological impact on German heavy tank crews rippled outward from the Manhay engagement. As word spread through SS Panzerabteilung Pharaoh 1 that 5 King Tigers had been destroyed in a single engagement by an unknown American weapon, The aura of invincibility that had sustained crew morale began to crack. These were not inexperienced crews, prone to panic. These were veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks. Yet, they had just learned that their supposedly impenetrable armor could be penetrated frontally at medium ranges. SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Wessel, commander of another King Tiger platoon in the same battalion, later wrote in his diary, "The men are shaken. We had believed ourselves safe behind our armor. Now we learn that the Americans possess weapons that can kill us as easily as we kill their Shermans. The confidence is gone. Every engagement now carries doubt." This psychological shift proved as significant as the tactical implications. German heavy tank doctrine had been built on the assumption of frontal invulnerability. King Tigers advanced directly toward objectives, using their superior armor and firepower to dominate any opposition. Discovering this advantage no longer existed forced a fundamental rethinking of tactics that German commanders, already struggling with fuel shortages and air superiority issues, could barely afford. American tank destroyer crews, meanwhile, reacted to news of the Manhay engagement with a mixture of vindication and frustration. They had always believed their 90mm guns were more effective than official assessments suggested. Combat experience had shown them that careful shot placement and the newer tungsten ammunition could achieve results that testing ranges couldn't predict. But they also recognized that their vehicles, with armor barely thick enough to stop machine gun fire, remained desperately vulnerable in direct engagements. The M36's thin armor reflected the tank destroyer doctrine that had shaped its design, mobility and ambush tactics rather than sustained combat. The vehicle's open-top turret, while providing excellent visibility and ventilation, offered no protection against artillery airbursts or even small arms fire from elevated positions. Crews referred to their vehicles as Purple Heart boxes, gallows humor, acknowledging that surviving combat in a tank destroyer required as much luck as skill. Technical analysis of the Manhay engagement revealed the precise factors that had enabled Caserta's success. First, the tungsten-cored T-30E-16 ammunition had performed far beyond the standard M82 rounds used in earlier testing. The tungsten carbide cores, significantly harder than hardened steel, maintained structural integrity under impact pressures exceeding 300,000 pounds per square inch. Second, Mitchell's precise shot placement had struck areas where even the King Tiger's massive armor was vulnerable. Turret faces, lower glacis plates, and side turret armor. Third, the engagement range of 450 to 600 meters represented the optimal balance point, where the 90mm gun retained sufficient velocity for penetration, while the King Tiger crews had insufficient time to respond effectively. But beyond these technical factors lay a human element that no ballistic table could capture: the crew's cohesion and trust. Caserta, Mitchell, Archer, Santos, and Walsh had trained and fought together for months. They understood each other's capabilities and limitations. When Caserta made the decision to engage frontally rather than withdraw, his crew executed without hesitation because they trusted his judgment. When Mitchell placed his shots with precision under extreme pressure, Archer's loading rhythm never faltered. This kind of crew coordination couldn't be manufactured in training exercises. It emerged only through shared combat experience. The wider Battle of the Bulge continued for another month after the Manhay engagement, with American forces gradually containing and then reversing the German offensive. M36 tank destroyers played crucial roles throughout this fighting, their 90mm guns proving effective against all types of German armor. By late January 1945, as American forces recaptured the ground lost in December, numerous destroyed German tanks bore the distinctive penetration marks of 90mm tungsten rounds. Statistical analysis of tank destroyer effectiveness during the Bulge painted a clear picture. M36 units achieved significantly higher kill ratios against German armor than M10 units with 76mm guns or towed anti-tank guns. More importantly, M36 crews engaged German heavy tanks frontally with increasing confidence, while M10 crews continued to seek flanking positions or call for air support. The psychological advantage had shifted. German tank crews now had to account for the possibility that any American vehicle might carry a gun capable of penetrating their armor. The production response, however, remained frustratingly slow. American factories continued prioritizing Sherman tank production throughout early 1945. The M26 Pershing, which finally mounted the 90mm gun in a fully armored medium tank, reached Europe in January 1945, but only in limited numbers. Fewer than 300 Pershings arrived before Germany's surrender in May, and only 20 saw actual combat. The vast majority of American armored units fought the entire war with Shermans armed with 75 or 76mm guns, weapons that remained inadequate against German heavy armor. This production conservatism reflected deeper issues in American military procurement. The industrial base, geared toward mass production of standardized designs, struggled to incorporate improvements quickly. Changing production lines from Sherman to Pershing manufacture required retooling that would temporarily reduce overall tank output. Military planners, focused on maintaining numerical superiority, chose quantity over quality improvements. The result was that American tank crews continued facing German heavy armor with inadequate weapons, even after the solution had been identified and combat-proven. Joseph Caserta and his crew continued fighting through the winter and spring of 1945. Cobra King survived the war, though not without damage. In February, during fighting near the German border, the M36 took an 88mm hit to the turret that wounded Archer and required weeks of repair. In March, mechanical failures sidelined the vehicle for 2 weeks. By April, as American forces pushed deep into Germany, Caserta had been promoted to staff sergeant, and his crew had become informal instructors, teaching newer M36 crews the techniques that had enabled their survival and success. The final accounting of Cobra King's combat record showed 14 confirmed German tank kills, including the 5 King Tigers at Manhay, 3 Panthers, 4 Panzer rifles, and 2 Stug assault guns. The crew had fired 93 rounds of 90mm ammunition in combat, achieving a hit rate of approximately 68%, exceptionally high for moving target engagement at combat ranges. They had survived situations the doctrine said were unsurvivable, primarily through Mitchell's gunnery skill, Archer's loading speed, and Caserta's tactical decisions. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, military historians began studying the engagements that had defined the war's final campaigns. The Manhay action received particular attention because it demonstrated so clearly how bureaucratic assumptions could nearly negate technological advantages. The failed 90mm gun had proven devastatingly effective, but only after combat necessity forced its deployment in situations the designers had never intended. Post-war interviews with German tank commanders provided additional perspective. Ernst Bachmann, the King Tiger commander who had described his vehicle as a moving fortress, acknowledged that learning about American 90mm gun capabilities had fundamentally changed German tactical approaches. After December 1944, we could no longer advance with confidence. Every American vehicle might be the one that could kill us. The psychological advantage we had maintained since 1942 was gone. The technical lessons from the M36's combat performance influenced post-war American tank development directly. The M46 Patton, which entered service in 1949, mounted an improved version of the 90mm gun as standard armament. The M47 and M48 Patton tanks that followed maintained this caliber, though with increasingly sophisticated fire control systems and ammunition types. The principle that Caserta's crew had proven in combat, that a 90mm gun with proper ammunition could defeat any armor on the battlefield, became foundational to American tank doctrine for the next 2 decades. The M36 Jackson itself remained in service long after World War II ended. The vehicle fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where its 90mm gun proved effective against North Korean T-3485 tanks and Chinese Type 58 tanks. Several dozen M36 saw service in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Yugoslavia maintained M36s in active service until the 1991 breakup, making it one of the longest-serving armored fighting vehicles in history. This longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of the design, a mobile platform for a powerful gun, sacrificing protection for firepower. The broader implications of the Manhay engagement extended beyond tank design. Military procurement processes were reformed to incorporate combat feedback more rapidly. The rigid separation between testing results and battlefield reality that had nearly prevented the 90mm gun's proper deployment was recognized as a systemic failure. New protocols emphasized continuous evaluation of weapon performance under actual combat conditions rather than relying solely on controlled testing. The psychological dimension of armored warfare, always present but often underestimated, received new attention from military theorists. The German tank crews' loss of confidence in their armor protection, triggered by engagements like Manhay, had measurable effects on tactical performance. Crews that had once advanced boldly became cautious. Units that had maintained cohesion under fire began showing signs of brittleness. The realization that American weapons could penetrate their armor contributed to the collapse of German armored effectiveness in the war's final months. For the five-man crew of Cobra King, the war ended not with dramatic final battles, but with occupation duty in southern Germany. They were among the fortunate ones who survived to return home. Caserta then returned to Philadelphia, married his pre-war sweetheart, and worked as a machinist for 37 years. He rarely spoke about the Manhay engagement, even to family, until historians tracking M36 combat records located him in 1978. Mitchell became an engineer, Archer a teacher, Santos a police officer, Walsh a carpenter. They reunited only once at a Tank Destroyer Association gathering in 1983, where they posed for photographs beside a restored M36 at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox. The 4 destroyed King Tigers at Manhay were eventually recovered and scrapped, their armor plating recycled into post-war reconstruction materials. No physical trace of the engagement remains except in archival photographs and official records, but the tactical and psychological implications of that 8-minute action resonated through the remainder of the war and beyond. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of the M36 Jackson and its failed 90mm gun reveals fundamental truths about warfare that transcend specific battles or technologies. First, that bureaucratic assessments made in peacetime often fail to account for the chaos and improvisation of actual combat. The gun that testing declared inadequate proved devastating when combined with improved ammunition and skilled crews. Second, that psychological factors, the confidence or fear that shapes tactical decisions, matter as much as technical specifications. German crews lost faith in their armor's protection, and that loss affected their combat effectiveness more than any material change. Third, that the gap between theory and practice in military affairs demands constant re-evaluation. The weapon systems that win wars are often not the ones that look best on paper, but the ones that perform when everything else has failed. For Joseph Caserta and his crew, the mathematics of that December afternoon in 1944 were brutally simple: 5 King Tigers against 1 M36. Official doctrine said withdrawal was the only option. Official testing said their gun couldn't penetrate King Tiger armor. But combat rarely respects official assessments. In 8 minutes and 33 seconds, with 5 precisely placed shots, they proved that sometimes the weapons experts dismiss as failures become the ones that change history. The failed 90mm gun had spoken its truth in tungsten and fire, and 5 of the most powerful tanks ever built had learned too late that invincibility is always an illusion waiting to be shattered. For Joseph Caserta and his crew, The mathematics of that December afternoon in 1944 were brutally simple. 5 King Tigers against 1 M36. Official doctrine said withdrawal was the only option. Official testing said their gun couldn't penetrate King Tiger armor. But combat rarely respects official assessments. In 8 minutes and 33 seconds, with 5 precisely placed shots, they proved that sometimes the weapons experts dismiss as failures become the ones that change history. The failed 90mm gun had spoken its truth in tungsten and fire, and 5 of the most powerful tanks ever built had learned too late that invincibility is always an illusion waiting to be shattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.